Beowulf survives today in just a single damaged manuscript written around the year 1000. We refer to this manuscript as the Nowell Codex, after a book collector who owned it in the 16th century. There are 5 texts in the Nowell Codex: the Passion of St. Christopher, the Wonders of the East, the Letter of Alexander to Aristotle, Beowulf, and Judith. Many scholars have argued that the Nowell Codex is not a random selection of unrelated texts, but that its contents were brought together because they had a relationship to each other. If this is true, then looking at the company Beowulf keeps in this manuscript can, maybe, tell us something about how early medieval readers interpreted the poem. Perhaps it can show us what sort of texts were considered similar to Beowulf in this period. So what kind of texts do we have here? Well, first up, the life of St. Christopher. Now, this looks like a standard saint's life, but it also has a rather fantastical side. The opening pages are missing from this manuscript, but in other versions of the story, the widespread belief that Christopher was a man with the head of a dog, yes, you heard that correctly, is often mentioned at the opening of the story. Christopher, a baptized Christian, is taken to a pagan king who interrogates him and bribes him to renounce his faith. He is tortured in various ways, but is delivered on each occasion by God. At one point, arrows fired at Christopher change direction and blind the king. Christopher tells the king to use his blood to heal the wound, and when Christopher finally dies, the king applies the saint's blood to his eyes, and he's healed. And in the end, the king becomes a Christian. So far, so sensational. Next, we have the Wonders of the East. This is an encyclopedic account of marvellous beings and beasts that early medieval Europeans associated with distant parts of the world, particularly India and East Asia. It's not really a narrative text. We're not told any coherent story. Instead, we get a number of ostensibly factual, note the scare quotes, accounts of strange entities, from giant ants to cannibals and indeed dragons. This text is heavily illustrated, unlike the other texts in the manuscript. Then, just before we get to Beowulf, we have the Letter of Alexander to Aristotle. This letter is a fictional work that purports to have been written by Alexander the Great to his tutor Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. It describes Alexander's travels in India as part of his programme of world conquest, and also his explorations in Asia. We get accounts of various marvels and wonders in this part of the world. Then we have Beowulf, and finally we have Judith, and this poem is based on a book from the Old Testament, the Book of Judith. In this narrative, the Israelites are being besieged by the Assyrians. Judith infiltrates the Assyrian camp, beheads their leader, and rallies her people to drive away their enemies. The poem offers a clear-cut good versus evil narrative. Judith is portrayed as a holy woman, as a great hero, and as an inspiring leader. The Assyrian leader, by contrast, is wicked, dissolute, and hell-bound. So those are the texts, but what about connections between them? In 1953, the scholar Kenneth Sissom suggested that an interest in monsters may unite the works in the Beowulf manuscript, and that the manuscript was a monster-themed compilation. How might this work? Well, Beowulf obviously is a text about conflicts with monsters. The Wonders of the East portray a range of strange, sometimes monstrous beings, and Alexander's letter to Aristotle has a significant sprinkling of such descriptions too. But things get a bit more tenuous after that. The fact that Christopher is usually considered to be dog-headed might give us our monster in that text, though we're obviously dealing with a noble, indeed saintly monster here. Judith is the most significant stretch. Is the barbarous leader of the Assyrians to be considered monstrous? There's no indication in the text that he looks anything other than human. A more recent study of this question is Andy Orchard's book, Pride and Prodigies, Studies in the Monsters of the Beowulf Manuscript. Orchard emphasises the appositional character of the manuscript, and apposition here just means things that are placed side by side or next to each other. So rather than suggesting that there's a single common denominator uniting all these 5 texts, he suggests that adjacent texts have the clearest and most fruitful connections. So let's try this. We'll start with St. Christopher, a Christian dog-headed man martyred by a pagan king. Dog-headed men are a staple of descriptions of unmapped fringes of the earth in the Middle Ages. That takes us to the next text in the Wonders of the East, which, in fact, mentions the dog-headed peoples. The Wonders of the East have an obvious connection to the Letter of Alexander. Both describe the strange marvels that are present in the unmapped east of the world. Alexander the Great is a figure with obvious points of comparison to Beowulf. He is the ultimate ruler and adventurer. When the letter to Aristotle isn't describing wonders, it's interested in warfare, the role of a leader, and the quest for glory. All of these, of course, are significant themes in Beowulf. Both Alexander and Beowulf are pre-Christian heroes from a pagan world. Alexander is from the Mediterranean classical world, Beowulf from the North Sea Germanic world. Judith, which follows Beowulf, is also a heroic text, though here the heroism of the central figure is born out of faith rather than supernatural strength. Here perhaps we get a Christian model of heroism to compare and contrast with pagan heroes. Alexander and then Beowulf, who had gone before. This is a manuscript full of texts about monsters and pagan heroes, but religious belief has the final word.